Good evening. This is John Bushka. Today I want to talk about conscription, in other words, the draft, and that's a picture of the memorial field at Fort Jackson, the Basic Training Center, and I'll just show one other picture. That's the gate. I've shown you that before, um, and the the basic the basic message is that even though we don't right now have an active draft in the United States, and we haven't really had one since 1973 when Nixon ended it as the Vietnam War ended down. We've had registration for the draft since 1980. We had a few years where we didn't even have registration, and the potential for conflict around the world and means that this and the instability of things means that this is something that can affect us again, at least indirectly. And there are other forms of what I would call conscription. And our ability to deal with this, if it comes our way, does affect our social standing. So, and our being included in things. So I wanted to just go through the main points today, and uh, and then we'll move on from that. It is a very important idea in my book, especially chapter 2 of this first book of Do As Do Tell, a Gay Conservative Lashes Back. I also talked about it in one chapter of the second book, and particularly there's a chapter on the draft as it was short, as it had been, and the talk about possibly um, reenacting it, that there was talk about that after 9/11. Um, but just going through some of the facts again, originally, back when Kennedy was in president, Kennedy had, when there was talk of problems in Vietnam, Kennedy had talked to Selective Service, and he wanted married men to be at the bottom of the pool. And that stayed that way until 1965, when the war in Vietnam started to escalate, and then only people with dependents, mainly fathers, male people with dependents, were deferred, but students were deferred, and student deferments became a really big issue, particularly, and that's covered in the second chapter of my book. Because I was an assistant instructor for 2 years in graduate school when I got my master's degree at the University of Kansas. I was in a position to actually, I taught to some courses, and I was in a position to give people grades, which could affect their staying in school and affect their keeping a deferment. And then I went into the Army myself in 1968 in a very sudden transition in on my own life. Wound up in special training for 4 weeks. So, and there were some odd circumstances later. So that's in chapter 2 of the book, and in the movie proposed that I've been floating around. It's actually, to me, it's quite an interesting story. But um, one of the important cases was Rosker versus Goldberg, 1981, which the Supreme Court did affirm the idea that um, drafting only biological males was constitutional. More recently, it came up, I think, in 2022, and the court deferred to rule on it because it said that he thought Congress was going to act on it soon, and so there wasn't any point in it taking it up again. Um, but the basic idea could be that Congress could eliminate even the requirement to register, which is for all people, essentially slightly after the 18th birthday, as I remember, to about age 20, all males, that is, the registration of all males. And remember, people who claim to be transgender, that are not exempted from registration. It's if you have a biological sex of male and it was recorded, then you have to register. Um, I would also say that in my own experience, when I was in special training toward the end of it, I saw some of the, when I was leaving and going back to the unit, to a regular unit, had passed the PT test, I saw some young men that were really bad off physically and who should never have been drafted, and they were almost being kept. They had been there 6 months in special training. They were almost, excuse me, they were almost being kept in prison because they were physically behind. That was literally what was going on, almost, and that's quite shocking, and it's something I would cover in a movie. Um, but Congress, even with a conservative president, or if Trump were to win, or a conservative Republican were to win, we could take an isolationist, viewpoint and decide that we don't need to register people at all for it. Or we could decide, on the other hand, that we should register all young adults in that age, which would, and that is include biological females as well as males. And it's the men who make the sacrifice. That's why I showed you that memorial field at Fort Jackson. There's a cemetery at Fort Jackson. It's the men who do the risk taking of when being drafted. That's the way it was in Vietnam, and that's the way it's been in most wars. Um, a number of European countries have a draft which is male only. Some of them are adding female now, and some of them offer other kinds of service. But there's also an issue that men that have left that country that live here, particularly with Ukraine, could find themselves losing their visas and being required to go back. I think I've heard that that's risk right now for Ukraine, for people in Ukraine. So this is something that matters. Um, you could also propose other kinds of national service in view of in as a substitute. You could even, that's been talked about. If that was done, then a lot of people would not be able to start the business, the startup companies and the careers on YouTube that they've had at very young ages, if everybody had to deal with this. So that's a very important idea. Now, the idea of conscription goes beyond just military service. It's really applying force on people to force them to do something for the benefit of society or others that they would not normally have done. So I would say the generalized definition is putting pressure on an individual to make with some kind of service, a sacrifice of time or property or opportunity, especially with some risk to their own physical safety, because of an external hostile or natural common hazard, external hostility or natural common hazard, such that if the individual doesn't comply, then others likely unknown to the individual are likely to be harmed. And you can think about ways that can come about, those that can generate some screenplay ideas, I think. We sometimes we're used to thinking about if somebody refuses to deal with this, they're overprivileged, and we've also talked about the idea of the demands of others. We sometimes hold public figures in the past who dodged the draft morally responsible, for not serving when they become president. Don't need to mention names here. Now there are many other examples of compulsory behavior where if you don't comply, there could be harm to others, which are sort of analogous to the draft. The lockdowns during COVID, for example, and there was actually a proposal to separate the elderly from the rest of the population into separate corridors. That was in some countries. Now, that would have affected me if that had been done. And some people see mandatory vaccination, and particularly for COVID for young adults, as something that is, and which was required on campuses, of course, is something that is a little bit of a risk to them, and that's been a controversy. I wouldn't say that about masks, but do understand the vaccine controversy with the mRNA vaccine, even though I did very well with them personally. Um, another kind of idea is that if you voluntarily, or you and your family settle and live in a disputed area out of some sort of ethnic or tribal or religious loyalty, then in a sense you're conscripting yourself and your children. You're kind of militarizing yourself and opening yourself up to hostility from the outside world, and you're taking that risk. And that's just something that should be borne in mind. Some more talking points um, that, civilization as a whole is becoming more unstable. The whole overshoot theory on top of climate change, the idea that the world is going to become a zero-sum game, which leads to religious nationalism, or a fascist kind of nationalism, where it's my country has to survive. That's how you're seeing Putin behave, I think, right now. But whether our world as we know it, this modern world that we have, is going to keep on working forever, that's a good question. There are some things we haven't taken care of, like the threat of severe solar storms, for example, like the Carrington event in 1859, the possibility of EMP in a war situation as opposed to a full nuclear attack, the possibility of new EMP, and that book, um, the next second, or the last second, I think was called for. Um, the so the idea of personal self-reliance or service participation may indeed need to be thought about a lot. I'd also mention that in Charles Moscos, who had helped in design the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy originally, was one of the people who was calling for resuming the draft after 9/11. There was talk of this a few days after the event had happened, and he even said, "Gay," email to me, that gays should get behind conscription. Um, if he did, then the ban and "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" would be lifted. He actually said that in an email to me. Um, and again, it's in the second book, but so the idea that you could consider substituting other kinds of volunteer service is certainly relevant. Peace Corps, joining a volunteer fire department, something that we depend on some people to do, that sort of is expected of some men. Volunteering for a major food prep and delivery service, which has its risks, as we found out in Gaza. So this is something that you could expect of people throughout life. Another thing is housing and sponsoring refugees. And in Europe, in Poland, it's practically been pseudo compulsory to house refugees from Ukraine. So this is something in other parts of the world, the concept in other parts of the world can really matter. Um, it does connect to critical social justice. Well, let me just say that, the individual sharing of service obligations when they're needed can be seen as a character issue. So eligibility to become involved in it, including the military, can infect the inclusiveness of persons who might be otherwise seen as inadequate or overprivileged. Um, have to keep hydrating my throat here. Um, the connection to there's even sort of a connection to critical social justice theory, because for some jobs, especially in academia, people have to show, sometimes in DEI statements, that they've actually been of service to specific minority groups, that's almost like part of their reparations or something, that they've actually gone out of their way to serve specific minority groups that are thought to be systemically oppressed. There's also a question of character. When are you expected to give up your own priorities and fight for someone else's interests, even when many of the people in that group are people you might have disapproved of perfectly. And we've seen that with some of the recent um, that controversy with some of the recent protests, especially with Israel and Gaza and so forth recently. Um, I just wanted to mention something else too. Um, Conscription, in a sense, can be extra legal sometimes. You can be compelled to give something up or do something, perhaps somewhat illegally, but not in a practical sense have any ability to do anything about it. I could talk about that with being canceled or with some of the internet risks and so forth. And I also just wanted to mention that, again, we've seen a very spectacular example around the world of hostage taking of civilians because of a political issue. Now, you can look into whether those people had voluntarily settled into a particular life, knowing that the risk, that might be something you would look at. But in general, this is something that could happen to anyone. There could be some sort of an incident anywhere, in a public space somewhere that an individual could be accidentally nabbed and drawn into, and then negotiated for a political gain for someone else, or particularly an international gain. And that the idea that that could happen to me and I've been very privileged myself in many ways, despite my limitations. I've gotten by very easily, much more easily than a lot of other people. So if something like that were to happen to me, that would just be unthinkable. But you see it happen. You see it happen on a big scale around the world. So it's a very disturbing thought that this would ever happen. But I just wanted to leave you with this discussion of conscription. It matters because if you're being able to deal with it, it affects your being included in other activities of life. And that's one of the themes of my books. And it's one of the reasons why Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a problem. So that's what I want to leave you with today. And I do thank you for listening.